You know how sometimes you just want to get a complex idea, feel really informed, but without, like, spending ages reading dense stuff?
Yeah, cut right to the heart of it.
Exactly. That's what we do here. And today, we're diving into something pretty fundamental: how we know what we actually know, especially thinking about faith and um, public truth in this really diverse world we live in.
Right. And we're leaning on some fascinating insights from Lesslie Newbigin, specifically his book, The Gospel in a Pluralist Society.
Yeah, Newbigin. He's quite a significant voice, wasn't he? Thinking hard about how Christian claims fit in a world shaped by science and loads of different beliefs.
Definitely. He spent years grappling with it. How can claims about faith be considered, truth alongside scientific facts in the public square? That's the core question.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive: help you, the listener, get a handle on things like dogma, the dance between reason and revelation, and the whole challenge of truth claims when everyone sees things differently. Hopefully, a few aha moments along the way.
Sounds good. Yeah. Let's maybe start with dogma, because Newbigin points out something interesting about modern society.
Okay, what's that?
Well, he observes that we tend to accept things as public truth only if they, stand up to scientific testing. Rigorous scrutiny
Right, and religious beliefs.
often get pushed into the category of personal opinion,
Yeah.
subjective stuff, what he basically calls dogma.
Okay, but let's unpack dogma, because Newbigin doesn't just leave it there, does he? He knows it's got a bad rap, historically.
Oh, absolutely. He acknowledges the misuse, but he argues that dogma, in a specific sense, is actually intrinsic to the gospel message itself.
How so?
He sees the gospel not just as good advice, but as news, something radically new, a gift of grace received by faith, and fundamentally it claims to be the truth.
The truth, that's a big claim.
It is, and he stresses you can't just reason your way to it from like general principles or common experience.
Mm.
It's presented as a new fact, a new reality.
So it's either the foundation for how you see everything?
Or it's a stumbling block, a major point you just can't get past. It forces a choice, really.
Foundation or stumbling block. That really frames it, doesn't it?
Mm.
And you think about everyday life, we encounter conflicting truth claims all the time. Work ethics, politics.
Everywhere. His point makes you think about how those claims land and how we respond.
But people push back against dogma, right?
Yeah.
Because of that history, coercion, suppressing thought.
Exactly. And that's a valid concern, historically
Yeah.
speaking. We can't ignore that connection.
Yeah, times when belief was forced. Definitely not good.
But here's Newbigin's counter-argument, and it's quite provocative. He says that this specific dogma, the dogma of God's free grace in Christ, when you understand it correctly, actually founds and sustains freedom of thought and conscience.
Wait, hang on. That sounds backwards. Dogma leading to freedom.
I know, it feels like a paradox.
Yeah.
But his logic is, if the gospel is truly about God's free grace, a gift, then accepting it must be free.
Ah, okay. So forcing it would contradict the message itself.
Precisely. Affirming it as universal truth means you have to uphold the freedom for someone to actually choose to believe it or not. It can't be coerced.
Okay, that's a fascinating way to think about it. Let's shift to reason and revelation. That age-old debate. Are they separate things?
Well, Newbigin offers a helpful angle. He suggests it's less about two different sources of information and more about two ways of interpreting the same data, the same experiences we all have.
Okay, give me an example.
Think about, say, the Exodus story in the Bible. A secular historian might analyze it purely in terms of, sociopolitical factors, maybe drought patterns, power struggle.
Right, human causes, historical context.
Yeah. But a believer, while maybe acknowledging all that, also sees in those same events God's personal action, his will being revealed. It's the same historical data, but interpreted through a different lens, revealing a different layer of meaning.
So believers use reason, just like anyone else.
Absolutely. Same rational faculty. But they see reality in what Newbigin calls a new light. A different pattern emerges.
But, and this is crucial, they can't really prove that pattern using the old framework, can they?
No, that's his point. You can't justify the new pattern by the standards of the old. All you can really do is invite others. Come and see. Look through this lens. Does this make sense of your experience too?
It's an invitation, not a logical proof from shared premises.
Exactly. Which brings us to that split you mentioned earlier, the we know versus we believe thing. It feels very real in our culture.
Yeah, science is often in the no box. Facts, religion, values, they're in the believe box, personal stuff.
And Newbigin points out, well, the answers you get depend on the questions you ask. Natural science became so successful, partly by focusing very intentionally on how things work, cause and effect.
And setting aside the why questions, the purpose questions.
Right. Because purpose implies an agent, a mind, intention. You can ask how a machine works by taking it apart.
But you can't find its purpose just by looking at the gears.
Exactly. For that, you need communication. You need to talk to the designer or someone who uses it, and that involves trust. Are they telling you the truth?
He uses that parachute analogy, right? Understanding the physics doesn't tell you if you should jump.
Perfect example. Trusting it with your life. That's a different kind of knowing. It involves faith, commitment. It feels, as he says, awkward because it's not purely objective data. It's personal trust with huge consequences.
And tracing the split back, he points to key figures like Descartes.
Yeah, Descartes. I think, therefore I am. That famous starting point.
How did that contribute?
Well, it led to a really sharp split between mind and matter, thinking substance and extended substance. And that immediately raised the question, how do we know our minds accurately reflect the outside world? It baked in a certain skepticism.
Okay. And then Kant.
Kant took it further. He argued we can't directly know the real world, the noumenal. We only know the world as it appears to us, the phenomenal world.
And the structure we use to understand it, like cause and effect, space, time.
Kant said that structure comes from our minds. Our minds impose that order on the raw data of our senses. It's not necessarily inherent in reality itself.
Whoa. So the rational order science finds might just be the way our brains work, not the way the universe is.
That's the implication in Kant's philosophy, yeah.
Huh.
It suggests the rational structure isn't found in creation, but imposed by human thought, which you can see has massive implications for any claim about knowing ultimate reality, including religious claims.
Okay, that's a huge idea. The way we think shapes the reality we perceive.
And building on that, Newbigin brings in Michael Polanyi. He observed that what we even count as a fact depends heavily on our underlying theories or frameworks.
So different theories can look at the exact same event and see totally different facts.
Precisely. The theory shapes the observation. It challenges that idea of pure, neutral objectivity. What you see depends on the lens you're using.
So even science isn't purely objective observation then?
Well, Newbigin argues it relies heavily on tradition, an authoritative tradition. No scientist starts from scratch.
Right, they build on previous work, trust findings.
Exactly. There's enormous mutual trust. You accept the tradition, the established methods, the body of knowledge, in order to even begin making your own contribution. It's a kind of faith, actually.
I believe in order to understand. Credo ut intelligim.
That's the phrase he uses, echoing Augustine. You accept the framework to gain personal insight. And even when someone challenges the tradition,
They're usually trying to make it better, more accurate, right? Not tear it all down.
generally, yes. The aim is to refine it, make it more congruent with reality, and then that refinement becomes part of the tradition.
This reliance on tradition and belief leads him to question the modern bias towards doubt, doesn't it? The idea that honest doubt is somehow superior.
Yeah, he pushes back on that. He asks, well, is this constant emphasis on doubt always humble? Or could it sometimes mask a kind of intellectual arrogance? He basically asks, how do the doubters know so much about what they claim is unknowable? How are they so certain that ultimate reality is beyond statement, or that the truth can't be found in Christ? Those are knowledge claims, too.
Huh. So the act of doubting itself rests on certain beliefs about the limits of knowledge. That's clever.
It is. And he sees this whole tension, objective knowing versus subjective knowing, reflected even within Christianity itself. The split between, say, liberals and fundamentalists.
Ah, okay. Explain that connection.
He suggests the fundamentalists focus on objective, propositional truth, and the liberal emphasis on personal, subjective experience are both sort of children of the Enlightenment's separation of fact and value, objective and subjective.
Two sides of the same coin, in a way.
Reflecting that broader cultural divide, he mentions Lindbeck's idea of the cultural linguistic model as a possible way forward.
Right. Seeing doctrines like grammar, rules for speaking truthfully about God within the community.
Yeah, it's an interesting approach. But Newbigin thinks the root issue goes deeper. To really heal that split, you have to tackle epistemology itself. The basic question. How do you know?
How do we know what we know? That's the core.
And he uses that great analogy. Culture is like spectacles.
The lenses we look through.
Exactly. Language, concepts, stories.
Yeah.
They shape our whole view of the world. And usually we don't even notice we're wearing them.
Until we meet someone with a completely different prescription.
Right? Then suddenly you realize, Oh, my way isn't the only way. It's a way. It makes you aware of your own cultural lens.
Which highlights a contrast he draws between how we learn in science and how some approach religious education today.
Yeah, he notes this emphasis in some circles on critical openness,
Hmm.
autonomy, sometimes even rejecting any idea of received religious truth.
He mentioned a report that even seemed hesitant about God-given authority.
Right, emphasizing instead this critical openness and suggesting Christians should almost try to act as if their beliefs might be false.
But Newbigin's point is, you can't doubt everything at once, can you?
Logically, no. Doubt always requires some belief to stand on. You doubt A because you believe B. You can't stand on thin air and doubt everything.
So even the most critical stance needs a foundation.
Some element of dogmatism, as even that report conceded. But Newbigin contrasts this with faith traditions, which are inherently built on a core set of beliefs held as true. Dogmatic, in that sense.
And he compares this to science again. A scientist has a personal commitment, a vision.
But offers it as public truth. A hypothesis to be tested, verified, hopefully leading to discovery. It's held with universal intent.
Okay. And this connects back to the idea of circularity, that all big worldviews, including science, have a starting point they can't quite prove from outside.
Exactly. Science assumes the universe is rational in order to investigate its rationality. It's a necessary starting faith.
And the Christian tradition starts with faith in a rational creator, and then seeks to find coherence and purpose and experience through that lens.
Yes. Which leads to this big conclusion. There's no neutral ground, no supercultural platform to stand on and objectively judge between different traditions of reason, whether it's Christianity or the modern worldview.
So choosing to live within the Christian tradition today, it's a conscious decision. It's not the default anymore.
It's a choice made within a pluralistic context. And how do you navigate that? He brings in Alistair MacIntyre's idea
Which is?
to live so fully within both your faith tradition and the surrounding culture that the debate happens inside you.
An internal dialogue, where the obvious truths of one clash with the obvious truths of the other.
Right. And the outcome over time depends on the comparative vigor and integrity of those traditions. Which one offers a more compelling, coherent account of reality?
The ultimate verdict being...
At the end of history, Newbigin suggests it's a long game.
Now back to Revelation, God acting in history. How does that relate to just regular history, secular events?
He acknowledges general revelation, that sense of God may be inherent in humanity, but says it's not enough to know God's purpose.
For that, you need something more specific.
Yes, you need to look at this specific community, Israel, the church, and its tradition of interpreting certain events as God revealing himself. He calls it the logic of election.
Meaning God chose a specific people and story.
Yeah. And there isn't necessarily some external logical reason why that group. The justification comes from within the story itself, how it unfolds and reveals God. It's something you grasp through faith, not prior reason. Its coherence is seen in retrospect or ultimately at the end.
What about overlaps? Biblical stories sounding like myths from other cultures?
He admits there's continuity, shared language, concepts, but insists there's also radical discontinuity. God doing something new, revealing himself freshly, even using old words.
And the Bible itself. It's not just a history book to be studied from afar.
No, he talks about indwelling it,
Yeah.
using it as the lens, the framework to understand all of reality.
Yeah.
He mentions Hanfrey of the Bible as a realistic narrative that renders God's character through story.
Like getting to know a person through their actions over time.
Exactly. And this way of seeing reality, this plausibility structure, isn't just ideas in a book.
It needs a community.
Yes, the church, the community, is the living embodiment of this alternative way of making sense of the world. It carries the tradition forward.
And choosing this community? It's the framework itself, not based on some prior logic.
It's the starting point. And ultimately, Newbigin would say, it's less about us choosing and more about being chosen by God to be part of this narrative.
Okay, let's talk about history having a goal. He contrasts the view that all times are sort of equal.
Yeah, historicism. Each period equally near to God. He contrasts that with the biblical view. History is heading somewhere. There's a promised end, a goal.
But not through human progress alone.
No, it's rooted in God's promise, God's action, not just inevitable development.
And the early church saw itself living between the times.
Right. Between Christ's victory already achieved and its full final manifestation still to come. So it's a time of both suffering and signs of the kingdom.
And we should avoid extremes, like thinking the end is here every time there's a crisis.
Or the opposite of becoming complacent, thinking nothing truly new or decisive will happen. The call is for patient hope, enduring confidence.
Right. And meaningful action now comes from having that vision of the future goal, even if the path isn't clear.
Precisely. We act based on that hope, knowing the future is ultimately in God's hands, but that Jesus has opened the way.
He also makes an interesting point about the book of Acts, how the gospel message often comes as an answer.
Yeah, people see something happening in the community, this new reality, and they ask, what's going on here? And the proclamation is the answer to that question.
So the church's life should provoke the question.
That's his suggestion. Living in a way that makes people curious about the reality being embodied, then the gospel message has context.
And this embodiment isn't about imposing culture. He mentions Roland Allen.
Right, Allen's missiology, Paul's method, brief stays, empowering local leaders, trusting the gospel to take root organically rather than long-term foreign control.
But contextualization has limits. The gospel itself has to remain primary.
Absolutely. True contextualization lets the gospel penetrate and judge the culture, bringing both challenge and grace. Corrections come from within the gospel story, applied to that specific context.
Theology, then, is the ongoing conversation within that community about how the gospel speaks to their world.
Exactly. Embodied by people living out that story.
Okay, but this claim to uniqueness, it faces huge challenges today. Pluralism, the desire for unity.
For sure. Skepticism about exclusive claims is strong. Thinkers questioning a single incarnation or one definitive revelation.
And that move towards focusing on shared salvation quests, soteriocentrism.
Newbigin critiques that. He worries it becomes too human-centered, potentially downplaying the objective reality of what God has done in Christ.
He talks about worldviews too, atomic, oceanic.
And relational.
Mm.
Individualistic West versus merged unity versus the interconnected view he sees in the Bible and many primal societies. He wonders if that relational aspect helps explain the gospel's resonance in some cultures.
So where does Newbigin land on exclusivism, inclusivism, pluralism?
It's nuanced. He's exclusivist about the unique truth of Christ, but not necessarily about who gets saved.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't limit God's grace strictly to the visible church. He's inclusivist in affirming God works everywhere, but rejects other religions as ways of salvation. He affirms pluralism in acknowledging God's work, but rejects denying Christ's uniqueness. Truth comes first, even while seeking unity.
Okay, that's clear. He also stresses language, right? Pentecost.
Hugely important. Language carries culture. Suppressing language is suppressing culture. He contrasts historical attempts to enforce sacred languages, like Latin or Arabic.
With Pentecost, where the message comes in all the diverse languages, God affirming diversity.
Yes, a key theological point.
But how do you judge cultures? You have to sometimes, right? Like the caste system example.
It's complex. Newbigin asks, are our judgments coming from the gospel itself? Or from our own cultural baggage, like Enlightenment ideals influencing how missionaries saw caste over time? It's not always easy to disentangle.
And that challenge applies to us too, critiquing our own Western culture from within.
Definitely. How do we, products of this culture, offer a gospel critique of it?
Hmm.
And he counters the idea that the Bible is just a cultural product by insisting it claims to speak God's words and deeds, claims made with universal intent.
So Christians live in tension, citizens of heaven, but engaged in the earthly city.
Always. The cross means rejection by the world, but that's not the end. Avoid withdrawing completely, but also avoid trying to dominate through worldly power.
And he really critiques the idea of a neutral, secular society.
Calls it a myth. He argues secular society has its own unexamined beliefs, its own gods, maybe the state, the market, individual autonomy.
And it often ignores the deeper questions of meaning and purpose, separating facts from values.
Right, but all facts are interpreted through values. A society claiming neutrality on ultimate aims risks becoming directionless or even tyrannical, divorcing politics from ethics. He says it's not neutral. It's basically a form of modern paganism with its own powerful myths.
Wow. Okay, so wrapping up, his main point is the gospel can't just be private opinion.
No. In a pluralist world, the church, the congregation has to be the living interpretation, the hermeneutic of the gospel, claiming public truth.
Even knowing a fully Christian society isn't really possible?
Right. But the biblical story can shape public understanding of truth,
Mm-hmm.
as it once did, and we have to embrace the paradox, Christ's power seen in weakness, in the cross.
It's that impossible possibility of salvation. Hearing without understanding, yet the gospel reaching people anyway.
Yes, it requires trusting God's sovereignty, even in what looks like failure, avoiding the trap of thinking mission. Success depends solely on our efforts. It's God's supernatural work.
So the church isn't God's manager, but a servant, following Jesus' example.
Exactly. Avoiding self-interest, like Jonah worried about his reputation more than the city and having that deep love, like Jesus weeping over Jerusalem even as it rejected him.
And the big temptation in a pluralist society is timidity, anxiety.
Yes. The call is to trust God's faithfulness, even if it feels like the church is being pruned. Pruning can lead to greater fruit.
Okay, so the big takeaway for listeners. Understanding truth claims today means seeing that interplay of faith, reason, culture, and recognizing everyone, even the most objective person, has underlying assumptions.
Definitely. So maybe reflect on your own lenses. How does your background shape what you see as true? What are the foundational beliefs, the plausibility structures you use to make sense of the world?
Good questions. And if this spiked your interest, well, there's plenty more in Newbigin's work. Or you could look into epistemology or sociology of knowledge. Lots to explore.
Hopefully this deep dive gives you a richer, more nuanced way to think about navigating belief and truth in our complex, fascinating world.